Can you tell me what book we're going to be talking about today?
Family relations and witchcraft or something like that. Family
Ooh,
family values. Okay, pagan family. The same thing.
wait, how are you
Same thing.
reading that?
Pagan family
Oh, you're reading it on
values.
the spine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Spinal catastrophism.
spinal catastrophism. Yeah, Pagan Family Values, Childhood and the Religious Imagination is the title of this book. So, what does that sound like to you? What are we going to be talking about?
Well, like I assume it's like in the same vein as like Christian family values, like stuff like that. So like just how like if children raised in pagan families or like if the values are any different than like regular like Christian values, I guess.
Yeah, um,
Something like that.
definitely not an inaccurate guess. That's a big portion of it. Comparing it to Christianity, um, is something that definitely happens in the book, but is mostly from the side of the people being interviewed, talking about their experiences with Christianity. Uh,
Okay.
what S. Zohreh Kermani, I really hope I pronounced
Mm,
that correctly, is concerned with when it
mm.
comes to pagan family values, childhood, and the religious imagination, is how children are treated through the lens of religiosity in pagan households.
Okay.
Um, and what that essentially means is so you have experience in what denomination of Christian?
Apostolic Pentecostal.
Apostolic. Okay, that's a really good example. Yeah, I knew I chose right.
Mm.
Okay,
Yup.
so um, it would be tackling how children's relationship with religion differs, say, from a Pentecostal family versus a pagan family.
Like religion in general?
Religion
Or
in
okay.
general.
Okay.
Spirituality might be more apt,
Okay.
um, because near the second, second third to third third of the book, um, Kermani talks about how a lot of the parents um, of the children that were interviewed and keep kept track of essentially during the study, which lasted a little over like almost a year and a half, from January of '06 to May of '07.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of the parents of the children, both interviewed in that and that took online surveys, said that they really didn't care what their kids chose, as long as they were spiritual in some way. Um, in fact, a lot of them even voiced that they didn't really care if their children turned out to be Christian, as long as they were spiritual in some manner that made them feel fulfilled. That's
Okay.
the goal of spirituality to them.
Okay.
There is an underlying sort of message in that a lot of those same applicants still voiced concerns about social issues such as women's oppression in religiosity, such as Christian
Mm-hmm.
households.
Yeah.
um, However, they still voiced the concern that they just wanted their children to feel spiritually fulfilled.
Okay. Yeah.
So does that meet, exceed, or like how does that interact with your expectations of paganism as a religion?
Well, I mean, I'd honestly say it probably meets because the pagans my interactions are pretty limited with pagans, but from my experience, they're pretty open-minded. Um, it's not like they're out here burning Christians or whatever. Like, um, from my understanding, it is mostly about like spiritual fulfillment. Um, yeah, I'd say I'm not really surprised by that, honestly.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the idea that they're not exactly out here hurting people.
Mhm.
Um, because Kermani brings up that there are really only two consistent religious factors in pagan is the term that's used. Most of the time that means Wiccan. Um, Oftentimes it extends into Discordianism, eclecticism, and sometimes Druidicism, um, or just Druid, I think some people say. But most of the time, pagan means either Wiccan or eclectic. And eclectic is just a blanket term that means anybody that picks and chooses from different religions what they want to follow.
Okay.
That falls under the blanket of pagan. Um, and the two core things, sort of codes of law in pagan society, are the Wiccan Rede, or Reda, I think it's Rede, that state the Wiccan Rede states that you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm others. Um, what most pagans, according to Kermani, around pages 85 and 95, Kermani explains that typically takes the form more of them saying, as long as you're not interfering with other people, do whatever you will to achieve fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
Because that Wiccan Rede is often taken as a sort of hedonistic practice to say, because I think the archaic way in which they phrase it is, um, lest it harm others, do what ye will, which some people take that to mean a pure hedonism, that just don't hurt others, but do whatever else. Um, that's not entirely true. It's normally taken to just mean fulfill yourself, don't harm others. There's also the threefold law, which is a sort of simple karmic system, in that whatever energy, and they mean this rather seriously, whatever energy you put out into the world will return to you threefold. So it very much harkens to the kind of pop karma of what you do comes back to
Yeah.
you essentially. Um, but yeah, those are really the only two majorly consistent factors of pagan and specifically Wiccan practice.
Okay.
Um, does it surprise you that there aren't more, or does it surprise you that there are any? It can be another option. I realize I've boxed you into two extremes.
Um, I guess you're talking about like paganism as a whole, right?
Paganism as a whole.
And those are the only like two unite, or not only, I guess, but like
Those are really,
consistent among the.
yeah, according to Kermani, those are two of the really only consistent law codes amongst anybody who would self identify as pagan. They
Oh,
would typically say threefold law, Wiccan Rede.
okay. Well, those are pretty like universal things. I mean, um, like even without like paganism, I guess, like I think that would be consistent among people in general. So I guess it doesn't really surprise me that there are that many. Um, yeah.
Okay. Um, okay. So focusing in on how paganism works in contemporary American society.
Mm,
So there are two big key phrases to hone in on the title, those being childhood and the religious imagination, and contemporary American paganism. So the way I see the book is it focuses on those two things simultaneously, but they are a little different. Because a lot of the book does focus on the history of paganism in America, which some pagans try to historicize and say that it's the oldest religion, that it traces itself back to the roots of human spirituality.
mm,
And other pagans, one Discordian person, blatantly, just outright claims, that it was invented in the 1960s, in order to have naked chicks dancing in this guy's front lawn, essentially. Um, the name of which is escaping me. Um, but so they range very severely on mythologizing and accepting. Um, and the truth of the matter is that paganism in its current form was invented, and that there are certain traditions that do harken back to older religions, but contemporary American paganism is not at all an old religion. It was, as that Discordian person said, majorly invented in the 60s and 70s. Um, and that is a problem for a lot of people's religious imagination because it is difficult to consider yourself part of a religion that has only been around for less time than like my mother's been alive.
Yeah.
Um, and some people accept that and just say that, well, it's about individuality. I feel fulfilled by engaging with the energies of the world. Um, and anything else is something that I've tacked on for ritual personal benefit. And that's how most pagans in this book operate. The rituals are not hard and fast. Most of them are improvised. Um, uh, in fact, it's characterized a little bit as a mostly improvisational religion. In that if you go to, say, a Spiral Scouts meeting, which is essentially a sort of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts event
Mm,
for pagan children, um, the rituals there from camp to camp might be similar, but once you branch out to different pagan families, different pagan communities, and especially if you jump from Wiccan to Discordian to eclectic, it gets wildly different. That the idea that you have to have a ritual circle, that's kind of there. Um, the idea of the four elements being at different corners of the circle, I guess like north, south, east, west. Um, those are common, but they vary in their specificity. You know what I mean? So, like, take communion
mm-hmm.
in like a Catholic setting. No matter where you go, you're gonna have a lot of similarities
Mm-hmm.
in communion. That it's always going to have the same basis, pulling from the same chapters of the Bible, verses of the Bible, rather. That it's going to have a very similar feel, a similar structure, because it's all trying to accomplish the same goal with the same framework. Um, what pagan rituals tend to do is that they're specified for the community that they live in.
Okay.
And where this brings us to children is the fact that um, children typically are not very conducive to long-winded and structured rituals.
Yeah.
Um, So, what is your experience with religious sort of rituals? I'm using that term very sociologically, even though it does have a sort of witchy connotation.
Yeah.
But what is your experience with sort of religious rituals growing up, Pentecostal?
It's very intimidating. Almost if you're not like used to how these things play out, it can be pretty frightening to very intense. It's very intense, specifically in the branch of Christianity that I was involved with. Um, but yeah, even from a young age, um, like I'm talking like 11 until like 18 or whatever. All of those, you I guess you reach the age of accountability. Um, so you're expected to participate in these very intense, um, but I would say it's borderline inappropriate
Mm,
for children that young, as young as I was, to be exerting themselves like mentally and physically in that manner. And it was almost like forced upon you. You weren't really given a choice. It was treated as something you had to do
hmm
in order to be like a fully fledged um Christian, I guess.
Right.
Which it's funny that you bring up the pagan modern paganism only um just emerging in like the 70s or 60s, because Pentecostalism is the same way. Apostolic Christianity, it only just came about. People only just started interpreting the Bible the way that Pentecostals do in like maybe the early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Ibiza Street, I think that's what it was called. But that's basically when the whole like Pentecostal apostolic thing like sprouted from, I guess. Um, so yeah, the parallels are interesting. They're both like pretty young religions. And they do their own like apostolic Christianity, which could be branched under like charismatic Christianity.
Absolutely, it is.
Um, they do their own thing. They interpret the Bible in vastly different ways than um older branches.
Yeah. Um, I think that what you're speaking to there of feeling like once you reach a certain age, you're expected to do this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and the force of the argument is that, well, this is what insert deity wants you to do.
Yeah.
That's something that drove a lot of pagans out of their religions that they were in growing
Mm-hmm.
up, namely
Exactly.
Christianity.
Yeah.
And this is not meant to be a hit piece on Christianity anyway. It's just that that's an experience that a lot of pagans had. When it's the dominant religion of a country, that tends to happen.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, one kind of interesting thing is that nearly every instance of somebody talking about their um, religious upbringing kind of spiraling them out of whatever religion they grew up in was Christianity. Occasionally it was Judaism, but Kermani makes no note really of any Islamic or non-Abrahamic religion where that occurred. I tend to think that that is purely a numbers game,
Mm.
not really an actual practice issue.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to note. Um, anyway, um, sorry, sidetracked myself there for a second.
Oh, you're good, dude.
What's interesting is that that sort of movement of like away from paganism, or not, sorry, away from paganism, away from Christianity and into something else just in general because of the demand
Mm.
at a certain age is reflected in the fact that Kermani um, only ever found around 3 teenage spiral scouts in her. And just for clarification, she went to spiral scouts meetings in a couple different states.
Okay.
Um, and uh, she only ever found around 3 people who had reached the teenage status of spiral scouts, um, um, which is predicated at being 14 and up.
Mm-hmm.
14 to 18 is teenage for the spiral scouts.
Okay.
Um, so the vast majority were fireflies, which were the youngest level, and actual spiral scouts, which is the mid range. Um, and what she notes is that in general paganism, there was only a retention rate of about 50% of second generation pagans. Um, Despite the fact that, and she notes this on page 49, that paganism really hammers home the idea that children cannot consent to religion.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and obviously that clashes with religion as a whole, because the idea of trying to continue a religion sort of predicates itself on the idea that you would teach children that religion, especially if you're a parent that wants to share your spirituality with your child. Um, so it's a very interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, they are happy that people are finding that their children are finding their own way, and yet they typically aren't.
Mm.
um, because there is this feeling that, oh, I just want them to be spiritually fulfilled, and yet with the advent of indigo children, that sort of is tied to the parent's own self-worth. Um, so this is a bit of a probing question, so feel
Okay.
free to not answer. Um, did you ever feel there was a time in your experience where you let your parents down by not wanting to participate in religious ritual?
Not my parents, but a parental figure.
Okay. Um, so that sort of experience of, letting one's superior down, or
Mhm.
specifically a parental guardian down, um, due to not participating, is very common.
Mhm.
Specifically with indigo children, um, in the 80s, 90s, a psychologist, I believe it was, came up with this idea of indigo children, where they took commonly held traits of a lot of children of pagan families, and determined that they were spiritually in tune more so than the average child. Um, Labeled them indigo children, so that these kids had indigo colored auras, that they were, in tune with the magical energy of the world and with the goddess herself. Um, the problem with that is that I say problem. The interesting factor with that is that a lot of the traits fall in line with ODD and ADHD.
Okay.
Um, so that's oppositional defiant disorder, and attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Um, just for the folks at home that might not know that. Um, so this resulted in a lot of parents who had kids that they did not want to discipline, or take to a doctor or a psychiatrist, because they believed that they were indigo children, and that the kids were there to teach them, which is a commonly held belief in a lot of pagan families. That even according to a central tenant, or not tenant, a central document in Wicca specifically, um, that was compiled in the 80s, um, says that children are essentially emissaries from the goddess, here to guide us as adults spiritually, as their parents, and that they're only here for a little while. I'll get into what that says about growing up in a little bit, but for now, that does position children as infallible. Because if children who are defiant, hyperactive, and disorderly are actually doing the will of God, or the goddess in this case, then it is not your right as a parent to discipline them, really. Um, Kermani points out the fact that this very same psychologist did not offer a solution to the fact that his own stated research showed that every case of a child killing another child, um, was a, as he described, indigo child. That his framework of ideals for indigo children were all shared by children who wound up killing other children. Um, Not, of course, saying that all children that have ODD or ADHD are, killers, um, but that a lot of the traits that would make a kid an indigo child, um, are not exactly always beneficial. And he
Mm.
offers no solution for not twisting their energies, as he calls it. Um, so, as we move on to discussing the idea of adolescence, there's this idea that children are the infallible ideal, and that adults are actually children who have already failed to live up to the ideal. How does that challenge your ideas of, well, anything? Like the way society is really structured? Because obviously, kids don't run around running for office and, putting out fires. It's adults. And feel free to ask a question in
Yeah,
return.
I guess I'm just a little confused what you mean by like children being viewed as already the highest good and adults being um less than that.
I do have a passage that I think will illuminate that rather well. Um, so, have you ever heard the phrase like "kids can see ghosts,"
Yeah.
or the idea that kids and dogs specifically are more in tune with spiritual energy?
Mm,
Not even in a pagan lens, even Christians or like just people that are any sort of spirituality from the new age of spirituality kind of tend to believe that kids can see ghosts, dogs can see ghosts, that kind of thing.
mm-hmm.
Um, there's a very interesting parallel in that a lot of pagan communities that practice ritual circles say that children under 13 and dogs can enter and leave the circle whenever they want because their energies are not as disruptive as adults. Essentially, meaning that they are better equipped to perform the rituals and don't have to take as many pains to do them normally, whereas adults have to try harder to engage with the goddess. Um, so because paganism, is a sort of religion of magic, children are positioned as this ideal of magic, and that you lose that as you get older, which means that your religious ideal diminishes as you grow older.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which I think is typically the opposite of what we consider to be normal. There's a common sort of maxim of respect your elders, or wisdom is associated with
Yeah.
age. There's a big trope in when you consider Eastern philosophy of the long white bearded man essentially who's been meditating on a mountain for 3,000 years in a wuxia movie, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that is inverted in paganism. Children are seen as already having achieved the height of spiritual success, and to quote the very final page of the Kermani text, um, in such fantasies of childhood spirituality, maturation can only be seen as a fall from grace. Holy children cannot really grow up because then they cease to be holy. Adult pagans construct childhoods, their children's and their own, to satisfy the needs of adult religious imagination, and they expand the world of childhood to include both imagined children and adults. So I gave you a little teaser for the solution to this problem, but the real center point there is maturation can only be seen as a fall from grace.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would agree with that. Because even not even just in paganism, um, pretty much in any religion, it becomes more like you have to actively work to maintain spirituality. At least in my experience, because I noticed as I got older, it was harder and harder for me to maintain the same level of faith I had when I was a kid. Um, but I don't attribute that to being closer to some kind of higher power. Um, it's mainly just because I was given more to think about as I got older. My beliefs were challenged more by the world and school, I guess too. And what worked for me as a kid doesn't work for me now. Um, I just don't find fulfillment in Christianity anymore. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't say it's anything spiritual. It just things that you believed as a child, just it's harder to rationalize them as an adult.
Right. Yeah, I think personally I would tend to agree with that. That it's a lot easier to accept things as a
Hmm.
child. Um, it through the lens of the pagan household. Um, I think that they try to solve that by giving their children a lot of religious freedom,
Hmm.
um, and saying, well, if they stay with paganism, and Kermani challenges that by saying, well, if your adults are attempting to be as close to children as possible, and your children are trying to stay children even as they grow up, then is there any room for real childhood? Um, or is everybody just playing a religion game where children aren't allowed to be children and adults aren't supposed to be adults? I think that while that's not exactly, I think, the force you were getting at, it does probe at it. In that paganism is codified as a religion of non-responsibility by Kermani more than once. In
Mm.
that, um,
I would agree with that.
yeah, its ideals are that one should not be punished for failing to hold up to some religious ideal. Um, and I think that you can see this rather easily in the fact that an adult can never be a child.
Mm.
You can't grow
Yeah,
backwards.
yeah.
Um, so she positions this very similar to how, and I think she even makes this connection to how the Victorians sort of pictured children,
Yeah, yeah.
and that the Victorians would often build out these ideals of children, of the angelic cherub with the wings and perfectly pure and all this, and almost none of the writing of that era actually captured the horrors of what they were going through.
Yeah.
Because it's this, I say none of the writings, none of the fictitious sort of idealized writings, because in order to have that ideal child, an actual child isn't necessary. It's a sort of commedia dell'arte thing, um, where like you can picture,
I don't know what that means.
yeah, you can picture what the ideal child is supposed to be. Um, Commedia dell'arte is an Italian theater thing, from like old Italian theater, where like if you saw a guy wearing a mask and like a diamond multicolored suit, you'd be like, ah, that's Harlequin, servant, sometimes two masters. Like you knew who he was
Okay.
before he even opened his
Okay,
mouth.
word.
Um, it's an archetypal character, like stock character cast.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So here the child is becoming um, the the child is becoming the stock character, and for that, real children, as Kermani says, are not always necessary. Um, in fact, because children often disrupt religious ritual, um, it is kind of antithetical to have this ideal child be around, because then you experience, oh well, it's kind of weird for the goddess's servant to be pooping in diapers, you know,
Yeah.
or the goddess's conduit even. Um, and that's not me, inventing things. That's a central kind of contention. Um, and the way that's answered is just by saying, well, these children aren't like, they're close. They're closer than we are, but they're not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So, sort of the equation to think about here is that childhood is perfect. So adults seek childhood, but children are not perfect, which is strange. But what that essentially boils down to is that just because children are experiencing childhood doesn't mean that they are the perfect encapsulation of it. Um, and I don't, Kermani never paints this as an intentional maneuver by pagans. It's just something that happens. Um, in that it's like saying, oh, I believe that a dog is the the best spiritual anchor in the world. And then you meet a dog and it runs into an electric fence. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
okay. Well, maybe not this one.
Yeah.
But some hypothetical perfect dog,
Yeah, like the forms,
the
stuff like
forms.
that.
Yeah. The Aristotelian
Yeah.
form, like the dog is meant to be this.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that dogs inherently are this.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of being applied to children here. Here's an actual quote from page 87 of the reading. Um, Kermani says the quote unquote child, the innocent, spiritual, natural child, is an integral part of pagan ideology. The existence of this idealized child, however, can necessitate mixed messages to the somewhat grubby actual child awaiting a response from the adult at the fairy mound. Um, which is related to an anecdote that Kermani shares about working at the fairy mound at a Spiral Scouts meeting.
Mm.
Which is essentially just like a playpen for watching the younger
Yeah.
kids. Um, but what happened there was that there was an older gentleman, like as in an adult, not like 80, um,
Mm.
who was working alongside Kermani, and a kid ran over and asked for help over an altercation. Said, "Hey, this kid, blah blah blah, did something wrong." Um, and it was like, basically asking one of you adults help. And Mike, the adult, that wasn't Kermani, said, the only adults I know are grumpy and tired. I'm not either of those things." But the kid was just like, yeah, 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 whatever. Like,
Yeah.
um, and this was not like a 16-year-old. Like, this was a fairly young
Mm-hmm.
kid. But it's so ingrained in their ideology and their practice, um, that the idea that this adult wouldn't be a center of authority is still strange. And Mike still got up and went and helped the kid.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not ignoring his responsibility, and the kid isn't denying his own subservience. Um, it is kind of just a recontextualization where Mike, the adult, is trying to teach this young one that adulthood doesn't have to be boring and tiring, and that childhood, what he currently has, should be held on to, no matter if that's actually possible or not. Um, what do you think? Do you think you're going to be childhood maxing anytime soon? Reviving your inner child?
I mean, I think it's good to, hold on to some of those attributes from childhood. I wouldn't go as far as to say I want to be a child again. I'm happy with the experience and the knowledge I've gained, but like things like having, like wonder at the natural world and appreciation for like really small stuff, I think that's objectively something to strive for,
Mm-hmm.
especially in how consumerist our society is.
Yeah,
I think it's good to be
we're getting
grateful.
economical. There's a treat for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um. Okay. Um. So that's really that's the core of the book, is that children have difficulty kind of being their own person in a religious society where adults are trying to be children too. But what that results in is actually a lot less disruptive than one may think. Um, and that's because while it's an attempt to kind of stratify
Mm.
adulthood and childhood in a different way than what we're used to, that's just kind of not possible if you
Yeah,
if you want to be able to help children navigate the world.
I agree 100%. Like I can put myself in the shoes of a child in that situation, and I can even think back to like me as a child, it would be very confusing to be put on this pedestal and be also searching for guidance and help in these like young, like older people, and just like being told that I'm somehow the incarnation of like the greatest good. And um it'd be very confusing because it's like, well, you're supposed to be that.
Yeah.
I it'd be like,
And obviously, this is coming from somebody who did live in a different kind of background, so it's difficult to
hmm
say how we would actually respond. But I do agree with you that there's a sort of what seems to be a natural
yeah,
response to seeing the big kid.
yeah,
And Kermani actually does get referred to as a child in an early anecdote in the book in the introduction, where they're assigning officer positions to the kids over various menial tasks, like, oh, you're the snack officer, you're the nap time officer, um, just for fun, you know.
yeah.
And one of the kids, I think his name's Ryan, says, "Oh, Z didn't get an officer position," implying that he believes that the author of this book, a grown woman, is a kid like him. Um, which I'm sure, knowing the context of the rest of this book, must have been very frustrating to the rest of the
Yeah.
adults in the room. Um, but ultimately, it does introduce this idea that no matter how wise the child is religiously, there is still a disconnect in that in that room, Kermani was probably the least childlike and conducting the most businesslike
Mm.
sociological, not experiment, field work. Um, you know, so that sort of stratification just seems like it comes naturally, and yet that child called Kermani another child, or at least seemed to believe that Kermani was another child. So maybe that is our biases from having lived in a society that positions ourselves this way. Um, I don't know. I still tend to agree with you, but I think there's room to question my own
Yeah.
beliefs.
I I don't know. It's really difficult to say because that's such a like upset of our like like how society has run itself for thousands of years. No one looks up to children. Always they're treated as inferior. Um, yeah. So I'd like to say it's like children looking up to parental figures is part of the natural process. But I mean, you're right. Like, I mean, there'd be no way of really knowing for certain because that's just the way society has organized itself,
Yeah.
you know?
um, at least beyond like a toddler. Like a toddler's going to look to something. But
Mm,
beyond that sort of like you genuinely just need something else to live.
yeah.
um, there is one last thing that I want to touch on
Mm,
because I think it's a good example of how these things, while important, still exist in a context. And that's the idea of the sexuality of children.
mm,
Which, scary topic, I know, buzzwords. Children and sexuality in the same sentence. Um, and it specifically comes in the form of CMA festivals, which are essentially these pagan gatherings that happen on the wheel, which is the pagan sort of holiday cycle,
mm,
to celebrate various things. And in a lot of them, Kermani noticed, clothing is optional, which seems like it would make it a no children space, at least in
mm.
most things. Not really the case in paganism, typically. And I know my tone of voice got lower, so it sounds like I'm being grave, but I just wanted to add emphasis. Um, so what's interesting is that because children are stratified as the top of the ladder, essentially, I don't know. This one, I came into this one very intrigued and concerned because um adults are allowed a sort of free form nudity at these events, even
Mm-hmm.
though there are children around. Um, However, sexuality in terms of its practice is heavily monitored. In that the adults that have children around um, are very explicit about not doing any of that around the
Mm-hmm.
children. Um, so while it seems odd, it's essentially just a changing of the lines. So currently, we view sexuality as nudity, or rather, nudity as sexuality. That nudity is inherently sexual. Um, but most pagans don't view it that way. They view nudity more in line with the natural world, and that anything that comes out of that involves sexuality, that is the actual thing to hide from children, to not involve children in. The children are not allowed to go around topless or
Mm-hmm.
without underwear, despite the fact that they want to. One of the parents that Kermani was walking with during one of these CMA events, her kids were constantly asking, oh, I want to be naked, I want to walk around like them, and the adult was like, I can't. Here's the actual line. Um, she wanted to take hers off as well, insisting, I don't like clothes. Her mother empathized, but stood her ground, saying, I can see that you don't understand why I'm saying this, but I want you to be safe. From the sun and from everything. The everything at the end of her explanation is a word fraught with dangers the parents seem reluctant to spell out, and Cricket, the child, eventually conceded to her mother's directive without pushing for clarification, keeping shoes and underwear on underneath her cloak. So the children are still not allowed to be nude because the parents, despite their hopes, understand that human nature is just not, that's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
At least under current, I
Yeah.
don't know, contextual factors. Um, there are communal showers at these CMA events in which, for most of the day, genders and age ranges are not separate. And in fact, families kind of get frustrated during the gender separation hour because it means that one parent has to watch like specific kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for like one parent households, that can become not safe. So they have to time their like showers effectively or like bathroom trips effectively. On the one hand, I completely understand the maneuver religiously. Um, and I think that my hesitation to accept it as a practice simply comes from my ingrained disdain for sexuality concerning children.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's made very clear that children are not involved and are very shied away from and kept from religious or not religious sexual activity at these events, they are still events where sexual activity happens rather frequently, um, though still kept private.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a time of day during a bonfire where, as it gets darker, children are sort of led away from the bonfire because it turns into a sort of like, grab your partner, go somewhere else sort of event.
Mm-hmm.
So children are led away because this is not the time for them anymore. I don't know. It highlights, I think, a tension between adulthood, sexuality, and childhood that most people in America, I think, would be rather uncomfortable with. What are your thoughts on it?
Gut reaction, I think it's really weird.
Yeah.
I don't think adults should be naked around children. Um, unless it's like um their parents and they're like really young or whatever. Um, I don't really think that's weird. Um, but I don't know. The the optics of it aren't. too great.
Yeah, it doesn't look good on paper.
Yeah, yeah, it's yeah, it doesn't. I mean, I guess it opens the door for unsavoriness, I guess.
It certainly drops one of the main barriers to that kind of illicit
Oh yeah,
activity,
yeah,
um, which I think is part of my reluctance to accept it
yeah,
as an appropriate behavior.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I guess I'm missing like why it has to be, you know.
okay, that's fair. That's on me. So nudity, and sexuality, but specifically nudity, because paganism is so spiritually meant to be in line with this ideal natural form
Mhm.
sort of ideal. Um, Nudity is kind of a prime state,
Okay.
um, where one is closer to spirituality than they are with clothes on.
Okay.
There's nothing really inherent across the board in paganism that seems to suggest, from the Kermani reading at least, that all pagans believe this. Um, in fact, um, there was, uh, just to um, kind of hammer home our concerns. There's a point. Um, in the interest of protecting children as well as preventing lawsuits, Spiral Scouts International understandably maintains a strict policy against nudity at its events. So this is a different thing.
Mm.
Spiral Scouts and CMA, different kind of events. Despite this policy, however, an extended discussion on the subject arose on the main Spiral Scouts email group when a list member, noting that Spiral Scouts was a group for pagan children and that pagans performed sky-clad nude rituals, wondered whether Spiral Scouts held nudist activities. So the phrasing of, and I'm going to continue that quote, but the phrasing of sky-clad there instead of just nudist,
Mhm.
does imply a sort of sacredness in that you're not naked, you're just wearing nature.
Okay.
Um, which I can see. I can see the logic.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
it's I think that at that point we are definitely getting into territory that I'm simply uncomfortable with because of my own proclivities and not
Yeah.
because of any sort of ethical thing.
Yeah.
When you're practicing it by yourself, go for it, And I'm not a religious authority. Me saying go for it is just my own personal views. But to continue the quote, um, nearly a dozen quick responses to this inquiry offered variations on the same answer. I would say that is a big no. Um, Noting it is important that Spiral Scouts, as I mentioned earlier, was the Boy Scouts slash Girl Scouts
Yeah.
event. One poster added a reasonable level of suspicion to her response, acknowledging that the original poster may have had positive intentions, but these intentions should have been clarified. So, several respondents pointed out that not all Spiral Scouts are pagan and that not all pagans perform skyclad rituals. On the contrary, one poster observed, "My experience with nearly 20 years of paganism is the vast majority of pagans do not perform skyclad rituals and are beyond tired of the stereotype." All the journalism professors living in squalor.
It's rough out here, man.
I'm leaving that one in. All the journalism professors live in squalor. Um,
No one goes into journalism expecting to make money.
I think they go in expecting to get shot. Like
One can
truly,
dream.
one can dream. Okay. Um. So, uh, I'll leave us with a couple final quotes from the book, and I want to hear your thoughts on them in relation to what I've told you here today.
Okay.
So, first up is I think really the central sentence. If I had to pick one sentence and say, this is Kermani's point about religious childhood imagination. Um, and it's this phrase: I suggest that contemporary paganism maintains a complicated tension between the valorization of a sort of self conscious, disingenuous naivete among pagan adults and an externally imposed perception of precocious wisdom among pagan children. Put simply, contemporary paganism seems to encourage a childlike immaturity in adults and an overly precocious maturity in children. So, do you think that Kermani, in what I've told you, effectively proves that? Um,
I think so. Um, just like, I mean, it's not even anything that you would have to infer, really. I mean, it comes straight from what they believe. They believe that,
yeah,
um, children are, I guess, more holy. Um, and that adulthood is meant to be spent striving for what you once had. But I mean, I would argue you can never really have again, because I mean, the you can maintain aspects of childhood, but to fully have childhood would require, I think, that you willingly degrade your own faculties as an adult. Um
yeah. I'm gonna jump in really quick and say that one of the most repeated aspects of childhood that pagans strive for is spontaneity,
mm,
um, which Kermani points out on this exact same page, 57, um, that striving for spontaneity is oxymoronic. Um,
yeah,
and
this yeah.
um, that did tickle me a little bit when I first heard when I first read that, because like
Yeah.
I didn't think about it that way, but yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But I do still get it. It's this idea that I don't want to sit around and be a sad old fart,
Yeah, for sure.
and be like, "Woe is me," because I grow up.
Yeah.
Um, and what a lot of pagans do to combat that, as Kermani sort of reports, is that they reconstruct their own childhood and say, "Oh, I've always been spiritual. I didn't know it back then, but I've always been spiritual." Um, or you know, linking experiences they had as a child or didn't have as a child to the truth of the world as they see it now. Um, and that's a sort of social currency in that, oh, I experienced, you know, I first heard the goddess when I was 13,
Yeah.
Um, and it's not dissimilar from most
Oh yeah.
mainstream religions.
Yeah.
Um, but it is a defense mechanism in a way, in saying, I didn't just randomly come about from this due to rebellion.
Yeah,
This isn't a postmodern anti-religion movement. It's like I
for
came
sure.
about from this because I wanted.
It's kind of like, I play the bass. So I had to put that in there. I had to get that in there. Dude, everyone's like, "Oh, so you played bass cuz, you can't play guitar." It's like, "No, I just like playing the bass."
Yeah,
It's cooler to say, "No, I just love playing the bass, man." And say, "No, I just can't play guitar."
but can you
I
play
settled
guitar?
for bass.
Did you settle?
No. I mean, I'd like to think I didn't. I like playing the bass.
Okay, sorry, that was a side topic, but I,
Yeah.
I wanted to know. Um, yeah, I think that's that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
um, and that it is important for one to make it known to others that this isn't just random,
Yeah.
that they
Yeah.
that they had some sort of calling, a
Mhm.
vocation. Um, on the flip side, relating more to the context of societal, expectations and other religions, Kermani writes in the conclusion on 183, um, that pagan religious childhood, much like pagan identity and pagan religious life, is shaped both in opposition to conventional societal expectations and in hopes of normalizing and legitimizing paganism within the context of larger society. So she writes just a little bit under that, pagans fashion themselves as exceptional Americans, producing a new kind of American childhood, one rich with fantasy, imagination, supernatural presence, and the spiritual capabilities of children. Um, it's brought up more than once that this is a kind of Nietzschean Ubermensch ideal, which may be me reaching a little bit, but it does stratify children into this ideal of this one is more spiritual than the other. This is the Ubermensch child. um,
Yeah.
Maybe I'm misusing that. Sorry, Nietzsche. He's rolling around in his grave. But
Yeah.
comparing to other
That
religions,
dude's in hell.
oh my god,
Ain't no way. Straight up.
straight up. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Mathers. We got this one coming in. He's coming to ISU next semester. Be ready. Um,
Mm, my bad.
that's okay.
That's funny.
They'll probably like you.
Okay, word.
um, so I gotta remember to cut this. I'm gonna leave this in. I'm gonna show the whole class.
Word.
Um,
I'd laugh at that. I would laugh at that.
would you laugh at this part where we talk about how everybody would laugh about it?
We gotta figure out if it's funny or not.
We got a debate.
Yeah.
Okay, reeling it back in. So the core of what I was of the book, I went on a little bit of a tangent with Nietzsche.
Yeah.
I got a little bit distracted.
Yeah.
Was that pagans both marginalized themselves and hope to be demarginalized in the same breath. In that way, Kermani and another author that she cites compares paganism in its current form to early Mormonism, in that they both purposefully focus on the differences in their religious practices instead of the similarities. Specifically because they know that, or they assume that becoming the in crowd to other religious communities is not really possible quickly.
Yeah.
So their fastest mode of becoming a community is to become their own outgroup and say, well, we are different than you, so we will be together in our difference. This pagan and this pagan and this pagan
Mm-hmm.
externally would be viewed as being very different people with very different beliefs. But once they're positioned all as outsiders to mainstream religion, suddenly they can come together to form a stronger community. Do you think that does more good for them or negative for them in the long run? And for their children who have to grow up as religious outsiders, despite the fact that it is an outwardly tolerant religion, prioritizing ecology, sexual ethics, stuff like that. It is still an outgroup, and that comes with discrimination. So, how do you think that will change sort of like retention rates or practices, even if you want to theorize?
Well, I think I don't. I feel like they're only um galvanizing the I guess negative uh preconceived notions that people have about paganism by, I guess, like choosing to function as an entire unit despite the fact that um there are many different beliefs within it.
Right.
um I don't know, because I'm sure there's some like branches of paganism that would be considered by the public to be pretty digestible, and then there's probably other branches that are maybe a bit more uh, extreme. I mean, that's not the right word to use there, but you know what I mean.
A little harder to grasp for the
Mm-hmm.
average American, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a salient point. I mean, included in the same umbrella are um, staunch druids um, that focus a lot on the history of their religion and mythologizing it and saying, this is a nature religion. We, the forest is a soul of its own. Things that a lot of eco sort of eco environment like environmentalism could get behind. You know, it's a
Mm,
sort of, well, you might not believe it religiously. A lot of people still empathize very severely with that kind of point. Um, but that's also included in the same umbrella as Discordians, whose whole religion was thought of to be a joke until like the 1990s. Like they were actually thought to be a joke religion that people just made up.
yeah.
And still, some Discordians who practice it think of their religion as a religion wrapped in a joke. But the idea is simply that chaos is so integral to living that how can you not worship it, essentially? Um, Go ahead.
I don't know if I. That's kind of stupid, in my opinion. I don't know. I don't. That's kind of. That's a really low bar for a religion.
No, they get further in depth on that. Um,
Okay.
um, I was they have a whole text called the Principia Discordia, but even then, um, it is it is still characterized by many to be. I think Kermani writes either a complicated joke wrapped up in religion or a complicated religion wrapped up in a joke. Um, so either way, there is religiosity in there.
Mm,
There are still aspects of, mystic. It's still a mystic religion. There are still, rituals and the idea of magic as something that one can dedicate themselves to. Um, uh, my definition was very straight to the point
yeah.
to emphasize the
Yeah.
differences, much like early Mormonism. um, but yeah, um, that's that's Kermani. That's S. Zohreh Kermani, Pagan Family Values, um, Childhood and the Religious Imagination in Contemporary American
I
Paganism.
had another question for you,
You have
if you
another
don't
question?
mind. If you
Yeah,
don't
go
mind.
ahead.
Um, kind of on the you mentioned earlier how Kermani didn't notice any um like teenagers, I guess, in the.
Yeah, the retention rate was very low, and she only ever met three specifically in the Spiral Scouts.
Mm-hmm. Um, I'm curious if that, because the way you describe paganism, it sounds like you described it as being very like loose and free form. Like there aren't really a lot of rules, I guess, and it kind of, well, at that point, like, is it what makes it a religion as opposed to an ideology? Um,
That's a good question. Um, I think to answer that would take us out of Kermani, but I'm totally willing
okay.
to do that. Um, and that Okay, there was an early sociologist named Emil Durkheim, and his claim to fame essentially was the phrase "there are no religions which are false," in that meaning that so long as people believe something to be a religion, people live by it, people worship it, people engage with it as a religion, then the practices being incoherent to you, being strange to you, being even downright morally and ethically obtuse to you
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter. It just straight up doesn't matter. Um, because there are no religions which are false. He is not concerned with the theological implications. Like, oh, you contradicted yourself. He is concerned with religion as it is, not
Okay.
as it could be. And he is sort of a founding scholar of religious sociology. And Kermani actually does quote Durkheim saying there is no church of magic, which obviously runs parallel to
Yeah.
paganism, a very magically laden religion. Uh, what Durkheim is saying by saying there is no church of magic is that magic is a very personal thing, in that the reason why there is no church of magic is that it's not something. It's a mystic tradition, so
Mm.
it's not something that you practice with others really. Um, However, paganism is a religion that practices magic. Well, let me rephrase that to answer your point more clearly. Paganism is a gathering of people that worship, namely a goddess, typically. That's a rather central sort of thing, is the goddess.
Mm.
Um, Tend to believe, if not practice magic, believe in magic. Um, have very strong beliefs in spirituality of the self, and your personal connection to spirituality in some nebulous sort of magical realm that changes depending on which flavor of paganism you're talking about. Sometimes it's more magic, sometimes it's less magic. Um, but the bar of what do we consider a religion, is rather undefined.
Okay.
Um, in the loosest terms, you could say that because they call it a religion, it's a religion, and that's all there is to it.
Okay.
Legally, they have a protected status. Therefore, the United States government classifies them as a religion. The A rather strict definition would be that you have to include rituals, spirituality, an object of deification, and a holy text.
Okay.
That would be a rather strict sort of set of ideals. There are a lot of religions that you would consider to be a religion that don't have those things. Um, but Paganism essentially does. Holy text is a little iffy, um, just because there's no real inspired text.
Mm.
But there are collections of pagan writings, essentially anthologized into more or less pagan scripts. The Principia Discordia, as I mentioned before, would be
Mm-hmm.
considered Discordianism's holy text in a way. Um, so, completely fair question.
Yeah.
But um, one thing that Professor Mathers brought up somewhat recently was, and I'm going to turn this back on you for a second. Do you think that if paganism were in fact 400 years old, 500, 600 years old,
Mm-hmm.
do you think you'd be asking that question? Do you think it's merely a case of recency bias, in that because they're new, they feel illegitimate? Or is it a legitimate case of their practices feel illegitimate as a religion?
Well, I guess maybe it's a bit of both. Rationally, I know I know that just because something was created recently doesn't mean it's inherently untrue. Um, sometimes truth reveals itself. I don't know, but no, purely on a superficial level, yes, I probably would take it more seriously. Um, but it also has a lot to do with it doesn't seem very coherent, I guess. Like it's not
No, I know
it's
exactly
not
where you're
as
going with that.
mythologized as like Christianity and Islam and like all of that. So,
Yeah, um, pagans. There are a lot of pagans that attempt to mythologize themselves and the religion,
mhm.
because it's like you said, it's a very obvious sort of trick. What am I leaning forward a lot?
No, your tootsies are touching mine, dude.
I thought that was the lamp. um, um,
Glad there's a lamp here.
Glad there's a lamp here. Oh, well, we weren't supposed to talk about it.
Sorry.
Um, the the maneuver, I think, very obviously, is to mythologize paganism and say, well, you can trace the roots back to some odd years,
Mhm.
to give it those roots and to say, oh well, this person back then was a pagan. I'm related to the witches. I'm related to, blah blah blah. Insert some prosecuted group, and through victimization, you gain a history and you gain a mythology, and that works both personally and religiously. um, that by sort of gaining that persecution, they say, look at how justified we are. I'm not saying that's a bad thing or that it's an inherently negative thing. It's just something that Kermani points out, um, that tends to happen. Um, Notably, there was one Discordian respondent. Um, you might warm up to them with this guy,
Uh,
um, because he said he was the one that claimed, paganism was invented in the 1960s by a guy who wanted to have naked chicks in his yard. Um, and what he followed that up with was, if you don't like Christianity and you really like to look at nature, change your name to Princess Fairy Moonbeam and, you know, go dance around in the woods with some patchouli. You know, it's a really easy sort of low stakes conversion process. Wickening as a process is a little more intensive, but even then, it's nowhere even close to like getting approval from a Jewish consistory.
mm,
So I think that part of it is that it is very loose. That's part of the appeal to a lot of people. Um, I think their response might be, why, if you know, why, if all these other religions are meant to be the absolute truth, do they have so many human centric rules? I guess, that are so entrenched in humanity and not in the natural world or in magic or mysticism. That's a kind of obtuse answer,
mm,
but at least from me.
yeah,
Um, but I think it does maybe get to the point of, it might be loose. It doesn't really have the coherent factor that a lot of
yeah.
other religions have, but maybe it will in 100 years. But if it gets to that point, will it really be the paganism it is now? I don't know. It's definitely an interesting question.
Yeah, I think I'm typically someone who like whether subconsciously or consciously, like I prefer to have structure in something.
A fully coherent system.
Yeah, like and I don't know, I guess I just don't see why it would be appealing, but also I'm not typically the kind of person that would be drawn to something like that.
Yeah, I I think that from a very person to person answer, it would just be that, well, they feel fulfilled.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's really all that matters. I mean,
Yeah. Um, Kermani points out multiple times that doesn't really result in a long lasting religion,
yeah.
but it does result in personal fulfillment.
Yeah.
Just as a brief aside, um, Kermani also does mention the fact that not a lot of studies have been done on second generation pagans,
Mhm.
and that hers is one of the like most intensive, I think. And it came out in 2013, with the study actually taking place, like I said, about a half a year from January of '06 to May of '07, um, 2007 and 2006, not 1907.
Okay.
Um, so it's possible that a lot of the changes that we're talking about, that we're worried this might happen, we're worried that might happen, may have already taken place. Um, it's brought up more than once in the book that there is a sort of window shopping Wiccan, that sort of exists. Of they read a few online articles, they buy a few stones,
Mm.
they buy some incense, they do a ritual, and they call themselves pagan. Um, Kermani doesn't take a stance on whether or not that's correct, and neither will I, because at the end of the day, if they're finding fulfillment in paganism, then. But there seemed to be a small amount of pushback from people that talked about that kind of pagan.
Yeah.
Um, in that while paganism as a belief may be loose, um, there is still a line for them. In that, if you reject even the basics of practicing it consistently, um, and doing it in such a manner that aligns yourself with some sort of coherent system, at least in your own space, then you are not practicing paganism. You are attempting paganism.
Yeah.
Um, which which um, does feel a little bit like a glass house. Um, you know, throwing stones in a glass house situation.
Ah. Ah.
Aha. Um, but it's still a good point where it's like, where is the line on the bottom end? We
Yeah.
talked earlier about the line on the top end of when is it a religion? What about the line on the bottom end of like when is it really paganism
Yeah.
versus when is it just pretending? I'm not sure we can answer that.
I was gonna say something. Kind of off topic. Um, I just think it's funny. I've seen it in Christianity as well. Um, there's maybe it's kind of reversing itself in the most recent times, but kind of like it has to do with paganism. There seems to have been maybe um like a kind of less of a focus on the truth, like on striving towards the truth, and kind of there it's more about personal fulfillment or spiritual fulfillment, I guess. um
I
yeah.
got something loaded.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what you're getting at is that there is a disconnect between the epistemic d- pursuit of older religions that say this is the truth of the world.
Mm,
This is everything. We've codified human behavior. This is what you're supposed to do. And that's been sort of taxonomized through decades, centuries, millennia
yeah.
of, written laws, councils, and great thinkers who have decided this is how it should be here. Paganism doesn't have that luxury. So I think what we're seeing is maybe something close to what the origins, something like Islam,
Okay.
Judaism,
Word.
or Christianity, Shintoism, Buddhism may have been, which is something that really prioritizes the individual and the small group,
Yeah.
not really the nation. Um, because it's very easy to apply things like Christianity, Islam,
Yeah.
Judaism to nation states and say, this is how humans are supposed to live. This is the epistemic truth. It is your duty as this kind of person to live this way. Whereas in paganism, they are still living by a truth. Um, and I don't think a pagan would look at another pagan living a very different life and say, hey, man, whatever. Like, they would still believe that they're doing it more correctly. But I don't think truth is necessarily a Boolean function to them. Like, it's not like you're either right or you're wrong, and those are the only options. I think there is a bit of a sliding scale,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this comes from the childhood adult sort of maxim, in that by by being stratified in adults versus children, all of the thinkers of paganism are failures because they're not children.
Yeah.
So they can't purport to truly know the same way that a wise old man in some other religion might know
Yeah.
that prioritizes the elder. Um, but it still is a fundamental difference, I
Yeah.
think. That really, I think you've touched on a central point that Kermani doesn't really engage with, and that is a central sort of truth seeking that is different in scale.
Yeah.
Any last questions before we wrap up?
No.
No more questions. All right, that was Pagan Family Values. Um, out of 5 stars, what do you give it?
The book?
Yeah, the book that you didn't read.
The book that I didn't read, I'd give it 5 stars.
5 stars. That's huge. Um, give it 4 out of 5. It was good. There were some sections that were a little dry, and I didn't really see the whole point sometimes. But ultimately, it answered its biggest questions, and it answered a lot of things that I was interested in. Kermani, you've done it again. I've never read anything else Kermani has ever written.
Don't bother.
Don't bother. I started with the great. All right,